"She's a drug addict," my father shouted so loudly that the courtroom fell silent. His voice echoed off the walls as every head turned toward me. Reporters scribbled frantically. Strangers looked at me with disgust. Even the bailiff glanced at me as if I'd already been found guilty. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I simply lowered my eyes and waited. Because I knew something no one else in that courtroom knew. My father wasn't trying to expose my secret. He was desperately trying to bury his own. The judge studied him for a long moment before asking one calm question that changed everything. "Mr. Harrison, are you absolutely certain you know what your daughter actually does for a living?" The color drained from my father's face. His expensive attorney suddenly stopped writing. For the first time that day, fear replaced confidence. I slowly reached into my briefcase. "Your Honor," I said quietly, "with the court's permission, I'd like to play a video that my father has spent 8 years praying would never be seen." The courtroom lights dimmed. The first frame appeared on the screen. My father's hands began to shake. He whispered only 2 words. "Wait, no." And in less than 5 minutes, the man who had spent years destroying my reputation would discover that the daughter he called a drug addict had spent those same years secretly building the evidence that would destroy him. The courtroom in downtown Chicago was packed long before the hearing was scheduled to begin. Every seat in the gallery was occupied by reporters, photographers, and curious members of the public. Camera crews waited outside the courthouse doors, hoping to capture the moment one of the city's most respected businessmen finally won custody of his late wife's fortune and publicly disowned his own daughter. Headlines had already judged the case before it even started. Millionaire businessman battles drug-addicted daughter. Former honor student falls into addiction. Family torn apart by drugs and lies. The public believed every word. Why wouldn't they? The evidence seemed overwhelming. Over the past 3 years, someone had anonymously leaked photographs of 28-year-old Emily Harrison stumbling through dark alleys, entering abandoned apartment buildings, sitting inside rehabilitation centers, and speaking with known drug dealers. Security footage had shown her walking into pharmacies late at night. Anonymous witnesses claimed they had seen her buying illegal substances. Social media destroyed what little reputation she had left. People called her a junkie, a disgrace, a disappointment. Even former friends crossed the street rather than acknowledge her. No one ever asked why. No one ever wondered if there was another explanation. Especially not her father. Richard Harrison entered the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle in his life. At 61 years old, he was everything the public admired. Owner of Harrison Medical Technologies. Donor to children's hospitals. Featured on magazine covers as one of America's most influential entrepreneurs. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. His silver hair was neatly combed. His posture was straight. His expression radiated dignity. To the cameras, he looked like the heartbroken father who had tried everything to save his troubled daughter. His attorney, Martin Collins, walked beside him carrying 3 thick binders filled with documents they believed would guarantee victory. Richard smiled politely as reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Harrison, do you still love your daughter?" He paused dramatically before answering. "I'll always love my daughter." He lowered his eyes, pretending to fight back emotion. "But sometimes, loving someone means admitting they're beyond saving." The reporters eagerly wrote down every word. It was the perfect quote. Inside the courtroom, Emily was already seated quietly beside her public defender. She wore a simple gray business suit. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head. There wasn't a trace of makeup on her face. She looked calm, almost too calm. She ignored the whispers spreading through the courtroom. She actually cleaned herself up for court. "I heard she's been arrested before." Poor father. What kind of daughter puts her family through this? Emily kept her eyes fixed on the wooden table in front of her. She never looked toward the gallery. Never reacted. Never tried to defend herself. Her attorney leaned closer and whispered quietly, "Emily, this is your last chance. If there's anything you've hidden from me, anything at all, tell me now." She smiled faintly. "I've hidden plenty." The attorney frowned. "What does that mean?" Emily looked toward the courtroom doors just as her father entered. Our eyes met for the first time in almost 2 years. Richard looked at her with complete disgust. Not sadness. Not disappointment. Hatred. Pure hatred. Emily simply nodded once, as though she'd been expecting exactly that reaction. Richard sat at the opposite table without saying a word to her. Martin Collins organized his files with confidence. Everything was going exactly according to plan. The judge entered moments later. All rise. Everyone stood. Judge Eleanor Brooks took her seat and scanned the courtroom carefully before opening the case file. This court will now hear the matter of Harrison versus Harrison. The room became completely silent. No one realized they were about to witness one of the greatest lies ever told under oath. And no one, not the judge, the lawyers, the reporters, or even Richard Harrison himself, had the slightest idea that Emily had walked into that courtroom carrying something far more powerful than any legal argument. Hidden inside her plain black briefcase was evidence collected over 8 long years. Evidence that had never been seen. Evidence capable of destroying one of the most respected men in America forever. But for now, she remained silent. And she let everyone believe she was exactly the broken, hopeless daughter her father wanted the world to see. Judge Eleanor Brooks adjusted her glasses and looked down at the thick case file resting on her bench. The courtroom was so quiet that the soft rustling of paper echoed through the room. This hearing concerns Mr. Richard Harrison's petition regarding financial guardianship, inheritance rights, and the protection of family assets, she announced calmly. Counsel, you may proceed. Richard's attorney, Martin Collins, stood confidently. He buttoned his jacket, picked up a folder, and slowly walked toward the center of the courtroom. Your Honor, he began, this is a tragic case. My client is not here because he hates his daughter. Quite the opposite. He is here because he has spent years trying to save her from herself. He paused, allowing the words to sink into the minds of everyone watching. Unfortunately, addiction has destroyed the young woman she once was. Several reporters nodded while typing furiously on their laptops. Martin continued. Mr. Harrison has paid for 4 rehabilitation programs, 3 private psychiatrists, 2 luxury treatment centers, and hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical expenses. He turned toward Emily. Yet despite every opportunity, she continued associating with drug traffickers, visiting narcotics hotspots, and disappearing for days at a time. He placed several enlarged photographs on an easel facing the judge. The first showed Emily walking into a rundown apartment building after midnight. The second captured her sitting inside a parked car with 2 men known to police. The third showed her entering a rehabilitation clinic. The fourth display, her leaving a pharmacy carrying several prescription bags. Gasps spread across the courtroom. The evidence looked devastating. Martin spoke with complete confidence. These photographs were collected over 3 years. They paint a heartbreaking picture. He turned toward Richard. My client has done everything a loving father possibly could. Richard slowly removed his glasses. He rubbed his eyes as though struggling to hold back tears. I failed her, he whispered. His voice cracked at exactly the right moment. I worked too much after my wife died. I wasn't there. And by the time I realized what was happening, my little girl was already gone. Several people in the gallery wiped tears from their eyes. One elderly woman quietly whispered, that poor man. Another shook her head toward Emily. She should be ashamed. Richard looked toward the judge with trembling hands. I don't want revenge. I don't want punishment. I simply want the court to prevent her from gaining access to the family estate. If she receives that money, she'll overdose within a year. Silence filled the courtroom. Even Judge Brooks appeared sympathetic. She slowly nodded. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. Then she looked toward Emily. Miss Harrison, would you or your counsel like to respond? Emily's public defender stood awkwardly. He was visibly overwhelmed. Unlike Martin Collins, he hadn't been hired months in advance. He had received the case only days earlier. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, my client denies the allegations. Martin Collins smirked. On what basis? The attorney hesitated. We believe. The evidence lacks context. Martin smiled confidently. Context. He picked up another folder. We have eyewitness testimony. medical records, private investigator reports, and financial transactions. What possible context could change all of that? The defense attorney had no immediate answer. He slowly looked toward Emily. She remained completely expressionless. Not nervous, not angry, not frightened, simply waiting. The attorney whispered, "Emily, if you have something, now is the time." Without looking at him, she quietly replied, "Not yet." He stared at her in disbelief. "Not yet." She gently folded her hands together. "My father has rehearsed this performance for years. He deserves to finish." Across the courtroom, Richard noticed her calm expression. For the first time that morning, he frowned. It wasn't the reaction he expected. He had imagined tears, fleeting, anger. Instead, she looked almost patient, as if she already knew how today's story would end. Richard felt a brief, unfamiliar knot form in his stomach. He quickly ignored it. There was no reason to worry. Every piece of evidence was on his side. Every witness supported him. The media already believed him. The judge appeared unconvinced. His daughter had no chance. Or so he thought. Because hidden beneath the stack of ordinary legal papers inside Emily's black briefcase was a small, encrypted hard drive. It contained thousands of files, videos, audio recordings, financial records, and one document that connected Richard Harrison to a secret so horrifying that by the end of this trial, no amount of money, power, or influence would be able to save him. Martin Collins smiled as he returned to the plaintiff's table. "So far, Your Honor, we have demonstrated a clear pattern of destructive behavior." Judge Brooks nodded slightly. "You may call your first witness." "Thank you, Your Honor." Martin turned toward the courtroom doors. "The plaintiff calls Detective Samuel Ortiz." A tall man in his early 50s walked confidently toward the witness stand. His gray suit fit neatly, and the silver badge clipped to his belt caught the courtroom lights. After taking the oath, he sat down and folded his hands. Martin approached him. "Detective Ortiz, how many years have you served in law enforcement?" 27. "And during those years, have you investigated narcotics-related crimes?" "Hundreds." Martin nodded. "Did you become familiar with Emily Harrison?" "Yes." "For how long?" "Approximately 3 years." The courtroom leaned forward. Martin picked up one of the photographs. "Can you identify the woman in this picture?" "That's Emily Harrison." "And where was this photograph taken?" "Outside an apartment complex that was under investigation for narcotics trafficking." Another photograph appeared on the courtroom monitor. "And this one?" "A known drug distribution area." "Another." "This?" "Near an illegal prescription pill operation." One by one, the photographs painted a devastating picture. Every location had a criminal reputation. Every image seemed to place Emily exactly where she shouldn't have been. Martin slowly walked toward the jury box. Although this was a bench trial, his movement was clearly meant to influence everyone watching. "Detective, in your professional opinion, did Ms. Harrison repeatedly place herself in environments commonly associated with illegal drugs?" "Yes." "Would that concern you?" "Absolutely." The gallery erupted into whispers. "See, I knew she was guilty. There it is." Even Emily's attorney lowered his head. Things were becoming worse by the minute. Martin smiled confidently. "No further questions." Judge Brooks looked toward the defense. "Your witness." Emily's attorney slowly stood. He looked nervous. Very nervous. He adjusted his tie before walking toward Detective Ortiz. "Detective, you never arrested my client, correct?" "No." "You never found drugs on her?" "No." "You never charged her with possession?" "No." "You never charged her with trafficking?" "No." The attorney paused. "So, despite watching her for 3 years, you never actually witnessed her committing a crime?" Detective Ortiz hesitated. "No." The defense attorney looked relieved for a brief moment. But, before he could continue, Emily quietly touched his arm. He turned toward her. She whispered only 3 words. "Ask him why." The attorney frowned. "Why?" She nodded. "Trust me." He turned back toward the detective. "Detective Ortiz, if you never arrested Ms. Harrison, why not?" For the first time since entering the courtroom, Detective Ortiz looked uncomfortable. He glanced toward Richard Harrison, then toward Martin Collins. Finally, toward Emily. The room became silent. He stopped. Martin immediately stood. Objection. Judge Brooks frowned. On what grounds? The answer is irrelevant. Emily looked up for the first time that day. Her calm voice echoed across the courtroom. I disagree, Your Honor. Everyone turned toward her. She slowly stood. The answer may explain the entire case. Judge Brooks studied her carefully, then looked back at the detective. You may answer. Detective Ortiz took a deep breath. I never arrested Ms. Harrison, because every time surveillance began, she was already cooperating with another federal agency. The courtroom froze. Martin Collins' smile disappeared instantly. Richard Harrison blinked. What? The detective swallowed hard. There were multiple occasions when officers were instructed not to interfere with her activities. The whispers stopped. No one moved. Martin quickly interrupted. Detective, you were instructed by whom? The detective looked toward the judge. I'm not authorized to disclose that in open court. Richard's confident expression cracked for the first time. He slowly turned toward Emily. She wasn't surprised. She simply met his eyes and gave him the faintest smile. Not a smile of victory, a smile of recognition, as if to say, now you remember. Richard felt his heartbeat accelerate. A memory buried deep in his mind suddenly resurfaced. 8 years earlier, a locked office, a missing flash drive, a frightened employee, and his daughter standing silently in the hallway, watching everything. For the first time in years, Richard Harrison realized something terrifying. Maybe he had never known what his daughter had really been doing, and maybe she had been watching him all along. The courtroom buzzed with whispers after Detective Ortiz's unexpected testimony. Judge Eleanor Brooks raised her gavel. Order in the court. The room gradually fell silent, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Only 10 minutes earlier, everyone had believed this was a simple case of a father trying to protect his family from a troubled daughter. Now, doubt had entered the room. Martin Collins quickly regained his composure. Your Honor, he said confidently. Whatever cooperation Detective Ortiz is referring to has nothing to do with the overwhelming evidence that Ms. Harrison has spent years surrounding herself with criminals. He turned toward Emily. Perhaps she was an informant. He shrugged dramatically. That still doesn't explain why she was in rehabilitation centers, why she met with dealers, or why her own father received calls from hospitals concerned about her. The courtroom slowly nodded again. Martin sensed the momentum returning. He smiled. At this time, the plaintiff calls Mr. Richard Harrison. Richard walked to the witness stand with practiced confidence. After taking the oath, he looked directly at the judge. I never wanted this day to come. His voice was heavy with emotion. When Emily was a little girl, she wanted to become a doctor. A faint smile crossed his face. She used to wrap teddy bears in bandages. The gallery chuckled softly. She had the kindest heart. His eyes became watery. But after my wife died, everything changed. He described sleepless nights, missed birthdays, arguments, disappearances, and countless attempts to help his daughter. I paid for every treatment. I hired therapists. I begged her to come home. His voice finally broke. But she chose drugs instead. Several people in the audience wiped away tears. The story was heartbreaking. It sounded genuine. Judge Brooks looked toward Emily. For the first time, there was disappointment in her eyes. Richard noticed it. Inside he smiled. Everything was falling back into place. Then Martin asked one final question. Mr. Harrison, have you ever abandoned your daughter? Richard answered immediately. Never. Have you ever lied to this court? Never. Have you ever done anything that would intentionally harm Emily Harrison? Richard looked directly into his daughter's eyes. Never. Silence filled the courtroom. Martin nodded confidently. No further questions. Judge Brooks turned toward the defense. Ms. Harrison, would you like to cross-examine the witness yourself? Emily slowly stood. Her attorney looked surprised. Are you sure? She nodded. I've waited 8 years for this conversation. She walked calmly toward the witness stand. Every step echoed through the silent courtroom. Richard watched her carefully. She looked exactly like her mother. That thought irritated him. Emily stopped only a few feet away. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, she smiled politely. "Good morning, Dad." Richard forced a smile. "Good morning." Emily folded her hands. "You testified that you've never intentionally harmed me. Correct. You testified that you've never lied under oath. Correct. And you testified that you always tried to protect me. Yes." Emily nodded thoughtfully. Then she asked a question so simple that no one understood why. Richard suddenly became nervous. "Dad, do you remember the evening of October 17th, 8 years ago?" Richard blinked. His confident expression faded for the briefest moment. I'm not sure." Emily tilted her head. "You don't remember? It was raining. Mom had been dead for exactly 6 months. You were in your private office. You weren't alone." Richard's fingers tightened around the edge of the witness stand. Martin Collins immediately stood. Objection. Relevance. Emily didn't even look at him. Instead, she reached into her briefcase. She removed an old silver flash drive. The room became completely silent. She held it up between 2 fingers. Richard's breathing stopped. His face turned pale. He recognized it instantly. It was the flash drive that had disappeared from his office 8 years earlier. The one he had searched for, threatened employees over, and secretly prayed had been destroyed forever. Emily looked directly into her father's terrified eyes. Her voice remained calm. "Your Honor, I believe it's time the court learned why my father spent 8 years convincing the world that I was a drug addict." She gently placed the flash drive on the evidence table. "And why he was so desperate to make sure no one ever believed a single word I said." Across the courtroom, Richard Harrison's hands began to tremble. For the first time in his life, the powerful businessman wasn't thinking about how to win. He was thinking about how much of the truth his daughter had actually seen. The silver flash drive lay motionless on the evidence table. Yet every person in the courtroom stared at it as though it were a loaded weapon. Richard Harrison couldn't take his eyes off it. His breathing became shallow. His hands, once steady enough to sign multimillion-dollar contracts, were now trembling beneath the witness stand. Martin Collins immediately stepped forward. "Your Honor, I object." Judge Brooks looked at him. "State your grounds." "This flash drive has not been authenticated. We have no idea where it came from or what's on it." Emily calmly answered before the judge could respond. "That's true." She looked toward the clerk. "And that's why I'm requesting permission to authenticate it through its original owner." She slowly turned toward her father. "Mr. Richard Harrison." The courtroom fell silent once again. Judge Brooks nodded. "Proceed." Emily picked up the flash drive but didn't plug it into anything. Instead, she asked softly, "Dad, can you tell the court what this is?" Richard swallowed. I don't know." Emily smiled faintly. "You don't know?" "No." She held the device a little higher. "Would it help if I reminded you? The serial number ends with 4H72. Richard's face instantly turned white. Emily continued. "You ordered 20 custom encrypted flash drives for Harrison Medical Technolog. IES. Only one of them carried this serial number. You kept it locked inside the bottom drawer of your office desk. You never allowed anyone to touch it." She paused. "And then it disappeared." A reporter whispered. "Oh my God." Martin immediately objected again. "Speculation." Emily ignored him. Instead, she looked directly at her father. "Did you report this flash drive missing?" Richard remained silent. Judge Brooks leaned forward. "Mr. Harrison, you are under oath." Richard slowly nodded. "Yes." Emily asked another question. "When did it disappear?" Richard hesitated. I don't remember." Emily opened a thin folder from her briefcase. "Ido." She placed a copy on the judge's desk. It was reported missing on October 18th, the morning after October 17th. Judge Brooks carefully examined the document. "It appears to be an internal security report." Emily nodded. It bears my father's electronic signature. Martin quickly interrupted. We challenge its authenticity. Emily smiled. I expected that. She removed another document. This one comes from Harrison Medical Technology's own server archives. Then another. And this is the police report. Another. And these are the insurance documents filed 3 days later. Every page carried the same signature. Richard Harrison's signature. Martin's confidence began to fade. The judge compared each document carefully. They appear consistent. Emily looked toward her father again. So, you remembered enough to file insurance paperwork, but not enough to remember losing the flash drive? Richard said nothing. A drop of sweat rolled down his forehead. Emily took one slow step closer. You spent months searching for it. You questioned your employees. You fired 2 innocent people. You even accused Mom's old secretary of stealing it. Richard whispered. Stop. Emily heard him. So you do remember? No. I said stop. His voice was louder this time. The courtroom stiffened. Emily's expression never changed. For 8 years. You convinced everyone I was addicted to drugs. You hired private investigators. You leaked photographs. You destroyed every friendship I had. You made sure no one would ever believe me. She placed the flash drive back on the table. And today, I finally understand why. Richard slammed both hands onto the witness stand. Enough. His voice echoed through the courtroom. I won't sit here and let her invent fairy tales. Emily didn't flinch. She simply reached into her briefcase one final time. This time, she removed a small black notebook. The leather cover was worn with age. Judge Brooks frowned. What is that? Emily looked down at it for several seconds before answering. My mother's journal. Richard froze. Every ounce of color vanished from his face. His lips parted slightly. No. Emily slowly opened the first page. The night before she died. My mother wrote something. She looked at her father with eyes that were no longer filled with pain, only truth. She wrote, if anything ever happens to me, Richard already knows why. The evidence is in his office. If Emily finds this one day, she'll know who her father really is. The courtroom gasped. Richard staggered backward. He grabbed the edge of the witness stand to keep from falling. For the first time in 8 years, the perfect father looked like a man whose entire world was collapsing. And Emily knew. The real trial had only just begun. A stunned silence settled over the courtroom. No one spoke. No one even shifted in their seats. The words from Margaret Harrison's journal still echoed through the room. If anything ever happens to me, Richard already knows why. Judge Eleanor Brooks slowly closed the journal and looked at Emily. Miss Harrison, is this the original journal? Yes, Your Honor. How did you obtain it? Emily answered without hesitation. It was hidden in my mother's old sewing machine. Several reporters exchanged confused looks. Emily continued. My father donated almost everything that belonged to my mother after her funeral. Her clothes, her jewelry, her books, even family photographs. She looked at Richard. But he forgot one thing. My mother always hid important things where no one would think to look. Richard lowered his head. He remembered. Margaret had always joked that the safest hiding place in the house was somewhere Richard considered boring. The sewing room. He had never entered it. Not once. Judge Brooks turned another page of the journal. The handwriting appears consistent. Martin Collins immediately stood. Your Honor, unless this journal is authenticated by a handwriting expert, it should not be considered reliable. Emily nodded. I agree. The courtroom looked surprised. Martin blinked. You agree? Absolutely. Emily smiled politely. In fact, I already had it examined. She opened another folder. This report comes from the state's certified forensic handwriting laboratory. She handed it to the bailiff. It concludes with a 99.8% probability that the journal was written by Margaret Harrison. Judge Brooks carefully reviewed the report. Martin's shoulders sank. Emily had anticipated every objection, every document, every challenge. It was as if she had spent years preparing for this exact moment. Because she had. Judge Brooks looked back toward Emily. Continue. Emily walked toward the evidence monitor. Your Honor, my father has spent today's hearing telling everyone that I became a drug addict after my mother's death. She paused. That is true. A wave of confusion spread through the courtroom. Richard looked up in surprise. Emily calmly continued. I did Pico. Me addicted. Gasps filled the room. Martin smiled again. He leaned toward Richard and whispered. She's finished. But Emily wasn't done. She looked directly at the judge. I became addicted to finding the truth. The smile disappeared from Martin's face. For 8 years, I stopped living. I stopped celebrating birthdays. I stopped making friends. I turned down job offers. I walked into dangerous neighborhoods. I met criminals. I visited rehabilitation centers. I spoke with drug dealers. Not because I wanted drugs, but because every one of those places connected to people my father desperately wanted to keep silent. The courtroom listened in complete silence. I let people believe I was an addict. I let neighbors insult me. I let friends disappear. I even allowed my own family to hate me. She took a slow breath. Because the more broken I appeared, the less anyone noticed I was investigating. Judge Brooks folded her hands. You deliberately destroyed your own reputation? Emily nodded. Yes. Because my father controlled newspapers. He controlled politicians. He controlled police donations. If I had openly accused him, I would have disappeared before sunrise. Richard slammed his fist against the witness stand. That's a lie. Emily calmly turned toward him. Then answer one question. Richard remained silent. You said Mom died in a car accident. Correct. Yes. Emily looked at the judge. Your Honor, I request permission to introduce Exhibit 24. The bailiff accepted a sealed evidence envelope. Judge Brooks opened it. Inside was a thick accident reconstruction report. She read the first page, then the second. Her expression changed. Mr. Harrison. She looked up slowly. According to this independent investigation, the brakes on your wife's vehicle had been deliberately tampered with before the crash. The courtroom erupted. Reporters jumped from their seats. People began shouting. Judge Brooks struck her gavel repeatedly. Order! Order! Richard's breathing became frantic. That report is fake. Emily quietly shook her head. No. It was buried. She looked him straight in the eyes. You paid a lot of money to make sure no one ever saw it. Richard stared at her in disbelief. His carefully built image was beginning to crack. But Emily still hadn't played the video from the flash drive. She still hadn't revealed what happened in Richard's office 8 years earlier. And deep down, Richard realized something terrifying. Everything she had revealed so far was only the beginning. Judge Eleanor Brooks struck her gavel repeatedly. Order! Order in this courtroom. It took nearly 2 minutes before the shouting finally stopped. Reporters hurried back to their seats, though many were already sending breaking news alerts to their editors. Outside the courthouse, television crews had no idea that the biggest revelation was still waiting inside a tiny silver flash drive. Judge Brooks looked directly at Emily. Ms. Harrison, you've presented serious allegations. If you're about to introduce electronic evidence, this court expects absolute authenticity. Emily nodded. I understand, Your Honor. She picked up the silver flash drive and handed it to the court clerk. I request that it be examined on the court's forensic computer. The clerk inserted the drive into a secure evidence laptop. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then a password screen appeared. Martin Collins immediately smiled. It seems your evidence is encrypted. Emily didn't even glance at the screen. She quietly spoke. The password is... She looked directly at her father. Margaret 0917. Richard's entire body froze. Only 3 people had ever known that password. Him, his late wife, and the person who had stolen the flash drive. The clerk typed the password. Access granted. A list of folders appeared on the courtroom monitor. Financial records. Private security. Board meetings. Camera archive. Office_SAM_17_OCT. The moment Richard saw the last folder, his legs nearly gave out. Emily's calm voice broke the silence. Your Honor, I would like to play the file named Office_CAM_17_OCT_08_14_PM.MP4. Martin Collins jumped to his feet. Objection. Judge Brooks looked at him. On what basis? We haven't established the chain of custody. Emily answered immediately. The video's metadata matches Harrison Medical Technologies' internal surveillance system. She handed another report to the judge. The forensic examiner confirmed it yesterday. Judge Brooks read the report carefully. After nearly a minute, she looked toward the clerk. You may play the recording. The courtroom lights dimmed. A large monitor illuminated the room. The timestamp appeared. October 17 to 8:14 p.m. A luxurious office came into view. Richard Harrison sat behind his mahogany desk. He looked 8 years younger. Across from him sat a nervous man wearing a white lab coat. Emily recognized him immediately. Dr. Alan Pierce, her mother's research partner. The room was silent except for the voices coming from the recording. Dr. Pierce slid a thick file across the desk. We can't approve this. Richard leaned back. And why not? Because the clinical trials failed. There are serious side effects. If this product reaches the market, people could die. The courtroom became completely silent. Richard's younger voice answered coldly. People die every day. Dr. Pierce shook his head. Margaret will never sign these approval papers. Richard smiled. She won't have a choice. Emily closed her eyes. She had watched this recording hundreds of times. It still made her stomach tighten. On the screen, Dr. Pierce stood up. I'm reporting everything. You'll lose the company. Richard slowly rose from his chair. His expression was terrifying. No, he said quietly. You will. The recording continued. Richard opened a desk drawer. He removed a thick envelope. Cash. Stacks and stacks of cash. Take it. Dr. Pierce pushed the money away. No. Richard's smile disappeared. Then he spoke 6 words that changed the atmosphere of the courtroom forever. Everyone has a price, or a weakness. The screen went silent. No one in the courtroom moved. Judge Brooks leaned forward. What happened next? Emily looked at the clerk. Continue the recording. The video resumed. Another person entered the office. A woman. Margaret Harrison. Emily's mother. She looked angry. What are you doing, Richard? Richard quickly closed the envelope. Margaret looked at Dr. Pierce, then back at her husband. I heard everything. Richard's confident smile vanished. Margaret stepped closer. I'm going to the authorities. You can't bury this. Richard stared at her for several seconds. Then, he slowly smiled. Not the smile of a loving husband. The smile of a man calculating his next move. The video ended abruptly. File corrupted. The courtroom remained frozen. Emily quietly spoke. That's where the recording stops. Martin Collins immediately stood. Exactly. He pointed toward the screen. It proves nothing. It doesn't show a crime. It doesn't show murder. It doesn't even show what happened after Mrs. Harrison left the office. Richard finally breathed again. For a brief moment, hope returned to his face. Maybe this was all she had. Maybe the damaged recording had saved him. Emily slowly reached back into her briefcase. She removed a second storage device. A black memory card. Smaller. Newer. Untouched. She placed it beside the flash drive. Then looked directly at her father. Her voice was almost a whisper. You're right, Dad. The office camera stopped recording. She paused. But the dashboard camera in Mom's car didn't. The courtroom fell into complete silence. No one blinked. No one breathed. Every eye was fixed on the tiny black memory card resting in Emily's hand. Richard Harrison stared at it as if it were a ghost. His lips trembled. No, it wasn't a loud denial. It was barely a whisper. Emily looked at him calmly. You recognize it? Richard shook his head instinctively. I don't. You do. It was removed from Mom's SUV after the accident. You ordered your security team to recover it before the police completed their inspection. Martin Collins stood abruptly. Objection. Judge Brooks raised a hand. Sit down, Mr. Collins. Her voice was colder than before. I want to hear this. Martin slowly lowered himself into his chair. For the first time in his career, he looked uncertain. Emily handed the memory card to the court clerk. It has already been authenticated by the State Digital Forensics Laboratory. She passed another report to the judge. Judge Brooks reviewed the certification. The metadata indicates the recording has never been altered. She looked toward the clerk. Play it. The courtroom lights dimmed once again. A dashboard camera view appeared on the large screen. October 17 to 9:06 p.m. Rain poured against the windshield. Streetlights blurred through the water. Margaret Harrison sat behind the steering wheel. She looked exhausted, but determined. She reached toward the dashboard camera. If anyone is watching this, she took a shaky breath. My name is Margaret Harrison. I'm recording this because I'm afraid. The courtroom became completely silent. Margaret continued driving. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Richard slowly closed his eyes. Emily never looked away from the screen. My husband has been hiding illegal clinical trial data. He wants dangerous products approved. I refused. She wiped tears from her face. I confronted him tonight. He threatened me. Several people in the gallery gasped. Judge Brooks watched without moving. Margaret reached into the passenger seat and lifted a thick brown envelope. Everything is here. The research. The financial records. The names. If you're seeing this, please protect Emily. Richard whispered under his breath. This can't be happening. On the video, Margaret looked into her rearview mirror. Her expression suddenly changed. Fear. A pair of headlights appeared behind her. Far too close. Margaret's breathing became rapid. He's following me. The headlights accelerated. A large black SUV filled the rear camera view. He found me. The vehicle rammed the back of her car. The courtroom erupted. Margaret struggled to control the steering wheel. Oh my God. Another impact. Harder this time. The SUV forced her toward the edge of the road. She screamed. Then, the screen filled with violent shaking. Metal twisted. Glass exploded. The recording froze. Black. No sound. No image. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Several jurors wiped tears from their faces. One reporter quietly lowered her camera. Even Martin Collins looked horrified. Judge Brooks slowly removed her glasses. Clerk, she said quietly. Pause the recording. The screen went dark. Richard Harrison stared at the floor. His shoulders shook. But Emily wasn't watching him. She was staring at the empty screen where she had just seen her mother alive. For the first time in 8 years. She took a slow, steady breath. Then she spoke. Your Honor. That's the video my father thought had been destroyed. Richard suddenly stood. His chair crashed onto the floor. I didn't kill her. His voice echoed through the courtroom. I wasn't driving that SUV. Silence. Emily slowly turned toward him. I never said you were. Richard's eyes widened. The realization hit him instantly. No one had accused him of being the driver. He had volunteered that information himself. Judge Brooks leaned forward. Her expression had hardened. Mr. Harrison. She spoke carefully. How did you know the person driving the SUV wasn't you? Unless you already knew who was. The courtroom fell into a silence so deep that even the air conditioning seemed loud. Richard Harrison stood frozen beside the witness stand. His breathing was ragged. Sweat dripped from his forehead. Judge Eleanor Brooks repeated her question. Mr. Harrison, how did you know the driver of that SUV wasn't you? Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For nearly 20 seconds. The billionaire businessman who had spent decades controlling boardrooms, politicians, and television interviews could not find a single word. Martin Collins hurried to his feet. Your Honor, my client is under extreme emotional distress. Judge Brooks never looked away from Richard. I'm sure he is. Richard finally spoke. I assumed. You assumed. Judge Brooks interrupted. You assumed because Ms. Harrison never accused you of driving. Richard swallowed hard. I misspoke. Emily slowly shook her head. No. You panicked. Richard glared at her. You've planned this. Emily answered calmly. For 8 years. She walked toward the evidence table and picked up one final folder. Unlike the others, this one was marked in red. Confidential. She handed it to the bailiff. Exhibit 31. Judge Brooks opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, phone records, private security contracts, GPS logs, and dozens of signed payment authorizations. What exactly am I looking at? Emily replied. The money. Richard's eyes widened. Emily pointed to the first document. The day after my mother's death, $250,000 was transferred from a Harrison medical shell company. She pointed to another. 3 days later, another $400,000. Another. $150,000. Another. $600,000. Every payment had gone to the same private security company. Blackstone Executive Protection. Judge Brooks frowned. What is Blackstone Executive Protection? Emily answered quietly. Not security. They specialize in making problems disappear. The courtroom stirred. Emily continued. They erased surveillance footage. They intimidated witnesses. They destroyed evidence. And she turned another page. They employed a man named Victor Kane. Richard closed his eyes. He knew the name. Judge Brooks read aloud. Victor Kane. Former military contractor. Licensed investigator. Deceased. Emmy. Linote. He died 2 years ago. But before he died, he made a recorded confession. The courtroom gasped again. Martin Collins buried his face in his hands. Emily removed a small digital voice recorder. This confession was given to the FBI during a plea negotiation. Richard whispered. No. Emily pressed play. A rough male voice filled the courtroom. My name is Victor Kane. Richard Harrison hired my team. The job wasn't to kill Margaret. The job was to scare her. Richard looked horrified. The recording continued. We followed her, blocked her, forced her off the road. But one of the guys hit her car too hard. A pause. Heavy breathing. Then, Richard called me 30 minutes later. He didn't ask if Margaret was alive. He asked one question. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Victor Kane's voice cracked. Did you recover the envelope? Emily quietly stopped the recording. No one moved. No one spoke. Richard stared blankly ahead. Judge Brooks slowly turned toward him. Do you wish to deny this recording? Richard's lips trembled. His lawyer leaned toward him and whispered. Don't answer. But Richard wasn't listening anymore. He wasn't looking at the judge. Or Emily. He was staring at the courtroom doors. Because they had just opened. 2 men in dark suits walked inside. Behind them, a woman wearing a Navy FBI jacket. She carried a sealed arrest warrant. Judge Brooks looked toward the newcomers. One of the agents spoke clearly enough for the entire courtroom to hear. Your Honor, we apologize for the interruption. He held up his credentials. Special Agent Daniel Reeves, Federal Bureau of Investigation. He looked directly at Richard Harrison. We've been waiting 8 years for this evidence. The agent unfolded the warrant. Richard Harrison, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, fraud, and your suspected involvement in the death of Margaret Harrison. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits to break the biggest story of the decade. Camera flashes lit the room. Bailiffs struggled to restore order. Richard Harrison slowly turned toward his daughter. For the first time in his life, he saw no fear in Emily's eyes. Only the quiet strength of a daughter who had carried the weight of the truth alone for 8 long years. And he finally understood. He hadn't lost the case today. He had lost it the moment his daughter decided she would never stop searching for the truth. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed toward the exits, desperate to be the first to broadcast the breaking news. Camera shutters fired relentlessly. Television producers shouted into their headsets. Outside the courthouse, news vans interrupted their scheduled programming. Within minutes, every major network carried the same headline. Bileona. Ire Richard Harrison arrested during live court hearing. Inside the courtroom, however, no one moved faster than the FBI agents. Special Agent Daniel Reeves walked directly toward Richard Harrison. Richard Harrison. He unfolded the arrest warrant. You have the right to remain silent. Richard barely heard the words. He stood motionless, staring at Emily. His entire empire, his reputation, his carefully crafted image, had collapsed in less than an hour. Two agents stepped beside him. One gently took hold of his arm. Richard didn't resist. For the first time in decades, he had no control. Martin Collins stood helplessly. Richard, I'll arrange legal representation. Richard never answered. His eyes remained fixed on his daughter. Emily stood exactly where she had been throughout the trial. Calm, silent, strong. The judge watched everything unfold before speaking. Miss Harrison. Emily turned toward the bench. Judge Brooks removed her glasses. I've served on this court for 23 years. I've seen greed. I've seen corruption. I've seen families destroy themselves over money. She paused. But I have never seen someone sacrifice 8 years of her own life simply to make sure the truth survived. Emily lowered her eyes. I made my mother a promise. The courtroom became quiet again. Judge Brooks nodded. And today, you kept it. Agent Reeves approached Emily after Richard was escorted from the courtroom. Miss Harrison. She looked up. I owe you an apology. Emily frowned slightly. For what? We knew your father was dangerous. We suspected corruption inside Harrison Medical. But every witness disappeared. Documents vanished. People became too frightened to testify. He smiled respectfully. You never did. Emily looked toward the courtroom doors where her father had disappeared in handcuffs. There were days I almost gave up. I almost destroyed every piece of evidence. I almost convinced myself everyone else was right. Agent Reeves nodded. What changed your mind? Emily reached into her briefcase one final time. She removed a faded photograph. It showed her as a little girl sitting between her parents on a park bench. Her mother was smiling. Her father was smiling too. Before greed had consumed him. Emily gently touched the edge of the picture. My mom always told me something. She smiled through tears. The truth doesn't disappear just because powerful people bury it. She said, truth is like sunlight. You can block it for a while. But eventually, it finds a way in. Agent Reeves quietly nodded. I think she'd be proud of you. Emily looked toward the courthouse windows. Sunlight was beginning to break through the gray clouds outside. For the first time in 8 years, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to disappear. 1 year later, Richard Harrison was convicted on multiple federal charges, including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, fraud, witness intimidation, and evidence tampering. The investigation into Margaret Harrison's death was officially reopened, leading to additional convictions for those involved in the cover-up. Harrison Medical Technologies declared bankruptcy after thousands of internal documents revealed years of unethical practices. Victims of the company's misconduct received compensation through a court-supervised restitution fund. Dr. Alan Pierce, whose warnings had been ignored for years, was publicly honored for refusing to approve unsafe medical products. Emily refused every television interview. She declined book deals. She turned down offers to profit from her story. Instead, she established the Margaret Harrison Foundation, an organization that provided legal assistance and protection for whistleblowers who risked everything to expose corruption. On the foundation's opening day, Emily visited her mother's grave. She placed a single white lily on the headstone. Kneeling quietly, she whispered, I told you I'd finish what you started. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. For the first time since that rainy night 8 years ago, Emily smiled without sadness. She wasn't smiling because her father had fallen. She was smiling because the truth had finally risen. The end. Lies may build empires, but truth has something stronger: time. Those who patiently protect the truth can outlast even the most powerful deception, because justice may be delayed, but it is never defeated forever.